Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The 2024 National Defence Strategy and accompanying Integrated Investment Program mentions uncrewed, robotic and autonomous systems a total of 57 times. Australia is investing around $300 million over the next 4 years and an additional $1.1 billion over the next decade in this area. Clearly, it's a significant area of concern for the Australian government given this amount of investment. One of the promises of drones and unmanned systems is that future wars will be fought by technology, not people. It's already been seen in Ukraine and elsewhere that drones and technology inclusive of small UAVs have been instrumental in saving lives. On the other side of that coin, military forces unprepared for the threat of drones will find themselves vulnerable to attack without means to respond to being observed, tracked and struck at a time and place of their enemy's choosing. So, how can the Australian Army alter an enemy's belief that they can achieve their military objectives through use of drones? How can we achieve our own effects? And what should we be considering now? Welcome to the 2nd Australian Division's last Tuesday of the month PME. I'm your host, Major Jeremy Barraclough. This evening's topic encourages us to consider the sizable threat that small aircraft, or SUAS, present. So, to help us find our way through this topic, we're fortunate to have Dr. Carl Rhodes, author of Small Aircraft Sizable Threats, produced by the ARC. So, some quick notes before we start. This is part of a CoveTalk series recorded on the 29th of October 2024. All information presented here is deliberately at the unclassified level, and views presented are those of the individual presenting them, not the Australian Government, Department of Defence or the Australian Army. Lastly, thank you to the program partners for making this so, being the Cove, the Australian Army Research Centre, the Randwick Barracks Officers Mess. Please subscribe to their content and also refer a friend. That's how we connect and that's how we find this material. Also, look out for the PME reading lists that are coming out on Libby and elsewhere and through the Defence Library Service. So with that out the way, please put your hands together for tonight's speaker, Dr. Carl Rhodes.
Thanks so much. Appreciate the invitation from 2nd Division. Appreciate the Cove broadcasting this and also helping to host this. So I'm Dr. Carl Rhodes, and I'm going to tell you today about small aircraft sizable threats. So if you have to go home and walk the dog, if the kids need to be picked up, at any time, you got to leave the live stream, you can find the report on the Army Research Center's website and download it there in PDF format. I have updated it though, because there is a lot happening in this field. Pretty much on a weekly basis, I need to update my state of knowledge as to what's happening around unmanned systems and countering those systems. And why is this important? So why should you care? Why does it matter? So I'm going to give you two little case studies as to why you should care. The first of which is in Ukraine. In one single week in October, the Army of Drones from the Ukraine claimed to have destroyed 220 military vehicles and facilities with drone aircraft. That's a lot of mass being used. They're using up to 10,000 UAS per month in their operations to achieve this kind of effect. So there is a lot of mass happening in that conflict and a big chance for destruction with these things. Secondly is, if we look at the United States military. So the United States military had a 70-year winning streak end in January. Before January, the last time a single American soldier was killed by an enemy aircraft was in Korea in 1953. A 70-year win streak ended in January when, in Jordan, a set of small UAS got under the radars there because they were shut down because there were friendly UAS in the area. Enemy UAS got in there, went and hit some sleeping barracks where Army officers were sleeping. 2 were killed. 3 were killed, actually. 3 were killed. So this is something that is a threat, is a problem. Even the best militaries are struggling with it today. A real challenge. So what are we talking about here? Control of the air. So I'm going to speak a little bit like an air power guy right now, just for a few seconds. Control of the air matters because it's the ability to conduct operations in various domains without interference from enemy air power. So you'd really like to have this over your territory such that you aren't surprised by an aerial attack. And over history, in the past 30 years or so, control of the air has typically been one of the first priorities of any integrated force. It would consist of taking down traditional air threats, if we look to the past, things like aircraft and airfields, aircraft if they reach the air, and taking down ground-based air defenses so friendly air forces can operate freely. Now, what's happened over the past 10 or so years? What additional concerns do we have to worry about? And there's a whole lecture I could give on the ballistic missile and cruise missile threat, which has always been a concern for major adversaries, but even lesser adversaries are getting capabilities in this area. That's a Houthi cruise missile there that has an anti-ship capability that's quite capable. So these things are filtering down to terrorists and sub-state groups. But if we look to the far right there, we see a small UAS. This is one that is a major concern, and there are no real good solutions. So today I'm going to explore this problem of how do we work through this new challenge of small UAS? What's happened over the past roughly decade in terms of the history of conflict? What are options to counter these things that are available today, and what are technology solutions? And what is a potential path forward to improve but not probably solve this critical problem right now? So if we look at current capabilities in this area, 102 nations today, or in 2020 I should say, have military drones. 102 different nations. 90 of those have drones that have a takeoff weight of less than 150 kilograms. This is military capability that is fielded in their military. Now if we look at the global market, it's a massive market. So it's estimated about 30 billion US a year today. Of that, about 5 billion of that is consumer drones. And the majority of that consumer drone market is controlled by Chinese companies, specifically DJI owns about 70% of the market in this area. Might change a little bit with recent bans by certain countries about using them for official purposes, but actually that market is relatively small compared to the massive consumer market. So if you go on the website of DJI today, you can buy this drone right here and have it shipped to your front door or pick it up at JB Hi-Fi. This is the DJI Mavic Pro 3. It's got a weight of about 1 kilogram. It can operate 15 kilometers away in an uncontested environment, send you a video stream, and you can control that thing. It's got 3 cameras on board, from 1 to 7 times optical zoom. You can get up to 25 times digital zoom on this thing. You can capture video, high-def video, and you can fly it for about 45 minutes. Great capability for surveillance, right? Sounds awesome. If only, militaries could get this capability very quickly. So this thing costs $3,100, delivered to your door. This includes the delivery fee. So now, what makes this advancing so quickly? What's gotten this there? Truthfully, it's actually the same kind of things that have made my cell phone so powerful over the past 10 to 15 years. This iPhone 16, which I had to replace my old one because my 13 was failing, is about 1,000 times more powerful than a Cray supercomputer from 1980s. It has satellite navigation on board. It has a great battery. It's got, we already talked about the massive processing, and it's got communications capability. These are the same 4 things that make that UAS so powerful. Advances in batteries, advances in processing capability, advances in sensors. The camera's gotten much better on the phone. All these things are making the UAS advance very quickly, and it's not military money that's funding it, it's commercial investment. The other thing that this Mavic Pro has is some built-in software that's very handy. You can draw in waypoints on a map, it will fly to them, it will do automatic obstacle avoidance 360 and figure out where it's going. You can click on a certain moving target, it will follow that target either with the camera or the UAV will fly a flight to follow the target on its own. A very cool capability. You might think of some good ways to use this in a military context that we'll talk about later on. So how have the enemies used this? So let's look at ISIL in Iraq and Syria from 2013 to 2017. they started building these things from parts off the shelf, hobbyist drones, sometimes even ordering them from online, and running ISR missions just using COTS technology in 2013. And there's some claims that they have used these to target various missile systems in certain strikes. That's why some of the strikes were so accurate. Haven't been proven, but there were claims made about especially a strike on a certain Marine base in Iraq. But by 2016, the enemy decided to take a styrofoam model plane and hook a booby trap bomb to it. They flew it, landed it near some Kurdish soldiers who were very curious and picked it up. It went boom and killed them both. This is the first time, I think, where we've seen a lethal strike using a small unmanned aerial system. So that was in October of 2016. By January of 2017, this group, a very small group of determined individuals, figured out how to rig a quadcopter such that it could drop a small munition onto individual armored targets. So they got so good, this little picture here, they got so good that they could drop a small grenade-sized charge directly into the hatch of a tank from altitude. And not only that, they were capturing the video, which was quite good for propaganda purposes. They were distributing it and doing a great job with this air campaign. And I'm going to call it a campaign on purpose, because by kind of the spring, Northern Hemisphere spring of 2017, just a few months later, they were flying 60 to 100 small UAS bombing missions a month. And if you talk to the commanders who were out in the field, like General Thomas, commander of SOCOM, he said these drones enjoyed tactical air superiority below our traditional air superiority. So, and the only solution to this, according to General Thomas, was using small arms fire. That was the only solution that made sense from a cost exchange benefit. Now, other allies in the region were using these things, were using defenses like Patriots to shoot these down. And there's a joke that one of the generals said at a conference. He said, there's an ally, I won't tell you which, but they're really good at shooting down these $200 Amazon drones with Patriot missiles that cost about $3 million a piece. So that is it may be an important thing to defend against at a one-time situation, but it's a sustained strategy. It's not going to work unless you're going to go bankrupt. So that's the ISIL story. And a big part of the story, if you read more in detail about this, is trying to interdict the supply lines of the parts coming into the country. But if we look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this is where things really took off in terms of small UAS. So the war kicked off in February of 22. The Ukrainians had great success with the Turkish the TB2 system. And this is a medium altitude system. It's about the same size as a Predator. And it got behind the Russian front lines. It was doing quite a bit of destruction of tanks, supply vehicles, those kind of things. And if you look at what the experts were saying at the time, a lot of the experts were saying, oh, we don't need tanks anymore. We just need these UAVs. Well, this time of success of the TB2 didn't last very long. It lasted maybe 2 or 3 months, because by March, one of these was shot down. It was probably exploited by the Russians. The Russians also reallocated their air defenses and pretty much negated the TB2's capability. And the head of Ukrainian intelligence said at a conference that, I don't want to say these things are useless, but we don't see much utility in having them out there. I'm kind of paraphrasing here. And he said the last one of one of these missions I saw with the TB2 was in the air for 30 minutes before it was shot down, $7 million aircraft. So this was negated. And if we see as things progress, the early part of the conflict, there was a lot of game, counter game, move, counter move between the two sides. So the Russians came to the fight with their own military UAVs and loitering munitions. So they had the Orlan 10, which is about a $150,000 system, military built. It's got hardened data links. It's got 4 different multi-mission payloads that you can plug in there that can do EW or spotting or other missions. it typically worked together with a Lancet loitering munition. And so the Orlan will work as a spotter, the Lancet would go in and finish the job. The Ukrainians had a very hard time with this initially and had to call upon a number of air defenses from friendly nations to help out with this problem. Wicked hard problem, and they're still dealing with this problem today because the Lancet is getting better, as we'll see later on in the story. Now the Ukrainians, with the TB2 down and out, had to come up with a new solution. And so they ordered a bunch of Chinese drones from off the shelf, specifically built by DJI and Autel. And they were using these commercial drones. These commercial drones have very known communications protocols and frequencies that they use. The Russians were pretty smart about this. They use EW techniques to find these things and take them out. So either jam the command links, or you can use EW techniques also to find where the pilot of the system is, so you can put artillery on their head. So there's something called an aeroscope system that can parse the protocol between the command center and the commercial drone that was built for various government organizations. And the Russians got their hands on some of these things and found them quite handy because they would encode the GPS coordinates of the pilot and of the aircraft in there. So all kinds of techniques, and pretty soon the Ukrainians caught on to this. They started switching out the radios with different frequencies. They started using software-defined radios, using different protocols. The Russians would respond. This was happening on a weekly basis. We're not talking months. We're not talking years. They're needing to change frequencies and change operations constantly to keep ahead of the other side. By this time, the Russians realized that having their military drones was great, but it would be great to have a low-cost capability to do long-range strike. And so they called on their good friends, the Iranians, and said, we're really interested in this Shahed 136. It's a one-way kamikaze drone, they call it. Now, what you call a kamikaze drone versus a cruise missile versus another type of munition is a matter of terminology. It's hard to say what's what, but these things work quite good, especially at saturation attacks. And so the Ukrainians you could hear these coming. They're very loud. They're like a lawnmower almost. And so the Ukrainians would hear them coming, and so they designed their own new smartphone app. So they hear the sound, they turn on their phone, they say, oh, I hear a Shahed. They'd point at the threat, it would report back to a central headquarters, and from that they'd be able to tell there's a strike coming in this way and help target the threat. And it led to a few shootdowns even. So this is getting civilians involved in the conflict and helping with the reporting. Then the real game changer for the Ukrainians, and the Russians have copied this quite a bit, are the first-person view racing drones, the ones that can go fast. So hanging out with a drone that doesn't move very quickly and hovers over the target is easier to take down than something that's coming in at 100, 200 kilometers an hour, and your jamming only has a limited range of effect. So if you're moving fast enough, the jamming will hurt your inertial navigation, but you might probably have enough accuracy to get in there and get on the target. So these things became very popular. They were building tens of thousands of these a month to try to meet the demand and using these for tactical strike. The Russians' first response was to cover up, use what are called cope cages. So they would put metal caging up above so you couldn't get attacked from the top. You even see this turtle tank there that I don't know how it's very useful for many missions, but it's not very vulnerable to attack from unmanned vehicles. So that and tactical jamming at the target level, where the target level is individual vehicles, individual people. That became the counter to this. So things are moving very quickly. This is maybe a year into the conflict that we're starting to see these kind of tactics take hold. Since then, and this is where I've had to do some new research, evolution and innovation continues. So the Russians have used saturation attacks to overwhelm air defenses, making the Ukrainians have to be smarter about how they're using their weapons, be better about the decide phase of their engagements. So if there's a cheap, UAV coming, a Shahed coming, they want to shoot it down with, a machine gun And if there's a hypersonic missile coming, they want to take that target out with the Patriot, for example. Being smart about allocation of weapons based on what you know about the targets, and knowing which of the targets are most important in that attack to interdict. The Ukrainians also developed their own long-range capability, and they both started building massive programs to build drones. So the Ukrainians invested $1 billion to build a drone capability. The Russians invested in licensing from the Iranians a capability to build Shaheds inside Russia itself. Since that time, and if you read the report, you'll see that I say, we haven't seen autonomy yet in terms of the end game engagement. That has happened since I finished the research on the report in December. We've seen some autonomous loitering munitions come into play that are able to pick out their own targets. This negates one of the key counters to these things, which is tactical jamming in the endgame. The Ukrainians have developed a pretty cool solution, which is an acoustic sensor array, a bunch of cell phones on sticks, basically, that listen for targets. They feed it all into a large computer that's able to do time difference of arrival and track targets moving through the airspace that are noisy. This has been a very useful technique because acoustic sensors they're not emitting. They don't have a signature. They're a passive sensor. And the last thing that I saw this happened about 2 or 3 weeks ago, was the thermite spraying Dragon drone that the Ukrainians pulled out, and the Russians had copied within a week. So this is a drone that hovers and spits thermite into wooded areas and trenches to get the soldiers out of there. It would be a nasty thing to be under there. Looks very Game of Thrones in real life. This is just a still taken, but if you see the videos of this, it is nasty looking. So we've talked all about wartime. Let's talk about things that have happened in Homelands. So on the top left there, we've got a visitor ban equals drones flying over prisons. So in the Hunter here in Australia, the maximum security prisons, the best way to get drugs in was through visitors visiting and sneaking stuff in. Well, with COVID, they stopped the visitor traffic, so they needed to find other ways to get drugs in. They being the people who are trying to make some money off this thing. So they hooked some drones to a bag, tied the bag to a string, tied the string to a drone, tried to land it in the area where they have some free time. Unfortunately, they crashed the drone, so they got caught in that situation. But that's one example of nefarious use that doesn't seem so bad compared to the rest. Israel to this day is still struggling with small drone attacks, even with the success of its Iron Dome. There's been drones spotted over UK nuclear sites, up to 25 different incidents. They don't know where they're coming from. The Trump shooter who tried to assassinate Donald Trump in Pennsylvania flew a drone over the area to get the lay of the land in preparation for his attack. President Maduro in Venezuela was unsuccessfully attacked with 2 1-kilogram charges carried by drone that didn't get him, but exploded well overhead and scared a lot of people. There's been drones seen over sites that are building sensitive military capabilities. So a Chinese graduate student in the United States was convicted of flying a drone over the site where they're building Virginia-class submarines. The Palmdale, what they call the UFO incident, was actually a set of roughly 10 drones, sizable ones, flying over Plant 42. That's where they're building the B-21 aircraft. They don't know where they came from. And the last one, military drones were sighted flying over Langley Air Force Base, United States. You would think the Air Force would be able to handle drones. This is the base where they house the F-22 aircraft. They flew over a period of 17 days. They would show up at dusk, typically, flying in groups of 10 to 12, from as large as things that look like roughly 50 kilos down to like 10 kilos. They would even fly in formation at times. And they couldn't find where they were coming from. They called in surveillance aircraft and didn't actually know how to engage them. And this is a problem both for the United States and for Australia. Who has the authorities to engage these kind of aircraft? Because it is not a military mission, it is a law enforcement question in both locations. And the authorities of how to deal with this threat, be it doing surveillance or preparing for an attack, how do you handle that is a critical question that I kind of touch on very briefly in the paper, but don't answer. It's a really important question for the future. So if you think about small UAS, and I've done a lot of efforts looking at aircraft requirements over time. And most of the time in the past, when we were looking at aircraft requirements I've done it for the United States Air Force, it's been looking at either how can you pack enough capability such that you can stand far away from the threat and survive and either surveil or strike the target from distance, or how can you create enough stealth and enough ability to see and penetrate the target without being seen, given your sensors and weapons, and attack that target, and that's usually a more expensive way to go about things. The interesting thing about these threats is because they're small, they are hard to detect, and even if you detect them, they're very difficult to engage. Number one. Number two, they are very capable because they can get near the target. You don't need much explosives if you can put it directly where you want to put it. If you can fly it into into a warehouse and put it on top of an armored vehicle that you want to go boom, rather than bombing the whole warehouse. And there are videos of the Ukrainians flying into Russian warehouses and saying, oh, that's a truck, that's a tank, let's go for that one. So the ability to use precision and to get in undetected into safe areas, very powerful. And most people just think of the surveillance and kinetic strike missions. But there's a lot of ways, if you have a little bit of imagination, that you could use these things. Australia is one of the world leaders in agricultural use of UAS, primarily to distribute fertilizer or pesticide with a big tank. You could put many other nasty things into that big tank and cause a lot of problems. Some other ways, signals intelligence, so directional signals that may be not vulnerable to detection. If you can put the UAV in the right place, in the beam of that signal, you may be able to collect that signal and get some information about that. Cyber attack, one of the hardest problems in the cyber world is getting access. If you can get close, many times you can get better access than from further away, especially for closed networks. So getting access in the cyber sense may be a way to use these systems. Even things like, pick up some soil or material to see what they're building in a certain area, or cargo delivery, or do a show in the sky that says, give up now, or else you're gonna die. Light show, influence operations may be a way to use these things as well. So there are many ways to use these beyond just the surveillance and kinetic strike mission, which most people think about. So if we think about countering these things, there's a couple different ways. The first of which is passive defenses. So doing things like being tough to see, camouflage, concealment, deception, use of decoys, dispersion of forces such that you're not masked. So if they find you, you're not all in the same spot, so you're easy to strike. Hardening of targets. We talked about the cope cages before. That will help. But it's no longer just your tank needs to be defended around the front and sides. It needs to be defended from top-down attack as well. I did talk a little bit about pre-launch destruction and disruption. I'm going to skip that here just in the interest of time. But if we think about active defenses, we think of the typical, the kill cycle, which is sense, decide, effect. I'm going to talk about the sense and effect here. The decide is just as important. I'm not going to talk about it, but it is a critically important piece of how you match targets to effectors. But you really have to think about this as a system. It's not just the pilot and the aircraft. If the aircraft is remotely operated, there's typically a data link between the pilot and the aircraft, both ways. There's typically a control station. That could be a point of attack for the system, be it jamming or cyber attack. There's the aircraft, which needs sensors to do things useful and might even be using satellite navigation. So thinking about this whole system, how do we disrupt this? And so I've divided it up into what are typically seen as the ways to sense and to effect. And so sensing, we've talked about acoustic. It should be noted that just the human has a capability to sense these things. So if you're sitting and one of those Mavic 3s flies by, Acoustically, you're going to hear it at 500 to 700 meters, most likely. It's dependent on the maneuvers it's doing and how hard the engine's working, but that's a typical range. To see it against an uncluttered sky, maybe 700 meters. Against more clutter, 400 to 500 meters is more likely. So these things can get in close. And if they're moving fast, you may have a hard time reacting in time. But that's kind of the human. Acoustics tend not to be the preferred solution unless you can set out a lot of acoustic arrays. Because acoustic sensors tend to have relatively short range. The best ones are about as good as your ear, 500 to 700 meters. And it gets hard in cluttered environments where you have a lot of other noises happening. Electro-optical and infrared works pretty well, but there's clutter things out there. There's things like birds, flocks of insects, clutter behind the target that you might see. That will work out to maybe a kilometer for most systems, except for the most exquisite for detection. And if you're trying to identify the specific type of system, you're talking maybe 500 meters, 400 meters, somewhere in that range. And the ones that can generate an image tend to have a relatively small field of regard. So it's best if these are cued by other systems, be it a radar or an acoustic system, to look in a certain area for the target. Radar and LiDAR, so this is the typical thing that you use for large aircraft. A radar system in, say, the X-band, which is typically used for military targeting or for aircraft control around an airport. That tends not to work for these systems. Like the Mavic has the same signature roughly as a bird. So there's a lot of birds in the sky, you're going to get a lot of false alarms. You need some way to narrow this down. Some have suggested moving to higher frequencies. That helps, but they have limited range and limited ability to cut through some of the weather, and sometimes a limited ability to scan the area. So that's a tough one. Radio frequency is another one that's been used. So this is listen to the signals. If you know what signals you're listening for, it works pretty well. If they're using new signals, like the aircraft that were flying over Langley Air Force Base, we're not using any signals that commercial aircraft and commercial UAS have used before for the control. So in that case, it becomes very hard to pick out the signal. You need to have some really good EW folks that are collecting that information and building you a library of what signals are we looking for and how can we find them. When it comes to effect, kinetics tend to work well. Shoot it down with AAA, shoot it down with a missile. The problem is the missiles tend to be very expensive compared to the thing you're shooting down. So a good solution in a pinch, not a good solution for the long term. Jamming, spoofing, hacking. So jam the GPS signal, jam the control signal. That works pretty well if you know information about the control signal it's using. If it's not using GPS to guide itself, if it's using inertial nav or an imaging navigation system, it won't work very well. Directed energy is probably where the future is in this mission area. It tends to be a laser costs about $3 to $10 a shot. You got to buy the laser system. It tends not to work in a dusty environment. And it takes a while to dwell on the target. So it isn't Star Wars where you go pew pew and you shot down 2 aircraft. You need to dwell on that target and burn it down, basically. So you're spending seconds on the target, single-digit seconds usually. But if you've got a group of 6 coming at you, that burns a lot of time if you're trying to get all those aircraft shot down. EMP or high-powered microwaves also tends to work. It works by shorting out the electronics. And they've even used things like eagles to go and catch these things. So birds of prey in urban environment have been used in the Netherlands, where the eagle comes and collects the UAS and brings it back to its handler. So don't use it if there's a kinetic payload on there, but anyway, interesting option. The problem is none of these work all that well. None of them are perfect. There's counters to each of these. And if we look at the sensors, I think it was, let me take a look at the number here. 50% of them use more than one phenomenology, and roughly 20% of them are using 4 different phenomenology to try to sense the target. This gets to where no sensor is perfect. They tend to cue each other quite well, and that tends to be a solution. In the effector side, the jamming solution was preferred, but this is 2020 when they're mostly dealing with commercial threats. whether the jamming solution is the best in a military environment, and whether you want to sit there with a jammer on the battlefield and broadcast continually to take down a drone, it could be an open question. You make yourself a target at that point. So in conclusion, small UAS are a threat today. They're not a future threat. They are here now, and they are not going away anytime soon. The advantages, they're difficult to defeat because they're challenging to detect and to affect. They're widely available. You can buy them off the shelf. You may need to modify them to make them a little bit better and to make them not detectable, just to standard commercial technology techniques. But you can buy kits to do these things pretty easily. And the technology is increasing and getting better and better over time, just like the technology in my phone is getting better over time. Capability delivered, you can get access because they're challenging to detect and affect to areas that were previously considered safe and free from attack. You can precisely deliver your effects to where you need them. So that means you don't need to deliver 2,000 pounds of explosives. Maybe 5 kilos of explosives is enough, or 1 kilo. And you get surveillance in a very small package, pretty much off the shelf if you want to buy it today. And the biggest thing is, for small UAS, the defense is much more expensive than the offense. That means that any smart adversary is going to grab these things and use them. It's a great capability. Countering them, the technology is continuing to be challenging. This means you really need to invest in a portfolio of technologies to continue to address this threat and advance them and work them as a layered defense. So if I think about a layered defense, if I have 2 systems, each of which shoot down 70% of the aircraft, that's more effective than a single system that can shoot down 90% of the aircraft. So you're better off with the minimum viable capability. I'll use those words, even though I hate them today. So that's a helpful thing. You need intelligence. That will really help your job if you're looking for ways to affect these things with jammers or with hacking. And the biggest thing is every soldier on the battlefield needs information about how to think about countering these systems. What do I do if I hear one of these systems? Can I identify what kind of system it is? Where do I report? Even if I don't know how to take it down, who do I call when I hear these counter UAS or these UAS systems flying overhead? Because it's going to be on the battlefield. So the United States Army has just implemented in their boot camp, the final stage of boot camp where they go out and do their 3-day field exercise, counter drone training into that training set. So every soldier in the United States Army is going to start getting it starting this week, I believe. Also, if we're thinking about inside Australia, we need to think whole of government about addressing this threat. We need to think about what are the rules, roles, and responsibilities of various parts of government for handling the threat, and who should do what, and need to come up with a strategy of how to deal with it. Australia has truly been the lucky country so far on this front. The UK has seen it happen at Heathrow. It's been closed by UAS. There were UAS seen flying over an event for the Royals, and they had to go find the person who was flying that thing. So we've been lucky here that there hasn't been a major event. So let's get ahead of the threat and consider ways to counter this. So with that, a very uplifting talk. I've given you all the answers to solve UAS, I hope, but happy to answer questions now.
Regulation of civilian UAS gives governments a bit more time to negate attacks, hopefully minimising infringement on freedoms. There are probably different models of regulation. Which do you like best?
Yeah, so most of the models of regulation that have been proposed rely upon compliance by the user of the aircraft or of the UAS system. So there have been things like transponders or something like transponders that send information back. Those are great. They've talked about licenses to have, to buy a UAS or to fly a UAS, and there are licenses once it gets big enough. But the smaller ones right now, you don't need a license if you're using it in a personal capacity. So do I have any great solutions for this if you want to get around the rules Not really. I mean, we need better surveillance of various sensitive areas, in my opinion, about understanding where the threat is coming from and who's operating these things. And we need to come under some kind of regulation to track the ones that are friendly or not harmful. So some kind of transponder type system or repeater system would be a helpful thing just to sort out the good guys from the bad guys in some sense. But I don't have a great solution, to tell you the truth, and nor do I think anyone has one if someone wants to do something nefarious. Because even the aeroscope system, the Ukrainians were able to work out around that by changing out radio systems and changing protocols. So there are ways to modify your systems that are pretty easy, not too tough. High schooler could probably do it if he knew a lot about UAS and electronics. Yeah, it's a wicked hard problem. We need more surveillance, and we need more ways to track the ones that aren't a problem, I think.
Major Demelza Newlove from Headquarters 17 Sustainment Brigade. My question relates to, you said that drones are able to deliver fire like Game of Thrones. What type of fire is that? What's it made of, and how do you put it out?
Yeah. So it's a thermite that it's delivering. So I'm not an expert on thermite, but I know it's quite nasty in terms of if it gets on your skin, it's not a good thing. So that is a new capability that they delivered, and the Ukrainians had a tube that was about yay long that they were hanging off of their UAS that was delivering the thermite, and the Russians came up with a much cheaper solution. I'm sure there's better experts on thermite in the room than me.
I've just got a couple of questions online. One's from Major Christopher from Headquarters 2 He says, along the lines of clearly there's a UAS and counter-UAS technology war going on as we go through the adaptation cycle between threat and adversaries. So how does a medium power or a smaller power like Australia stay competitive, or a similar power stay competitive, and how do we stay engaged? How do we reduce that, the factory to frontline adaptation cycle, and how do we keep up with the threats as they emerge?
Yeah, exactly. Very good question. So all the questions so far have been great. So I think first of all, you need to learn the lessons of other countries and understand what's happening. So invest in that lessons learned from what other countries are doing, because the rest of the world is also watching this. So that's number one. The second is, to get better at counter UAS, you probably need to be pretty good at UAS. So getting UAS to more operators in the field to allow them to test with these things, that gets them in the mindset of how do I complete my mission without getting shot down, and then transfer that knowledge to the other side that's thinking counter UAS. The other piece is, I think, a leap ahead technology. So look, the Ukrainians have moved very quickly. They aren't necessarily a major power, but they have moved quickly and thought imaginatively. This is one where we as a nation need to move quickly. There are things that are happening in autonomy and swarming technology where these could be jump ahead technologies for the nation. ASCA should be looking at these kind of things, especially swarming technology. How can UAS work together on their own without human oversight, but to complete a mission? How can they coordinate? This is mainly a software problem and an inter-UAS communication problem. And we got people who know software well, and we can buy these UAS off the shelf. So let's get to it. Let's go at it, and let's build a capability that's going to be useful.
Nice. So slightly different tack. We've got Lieutenant Colonel Hawkins from online at Headquarters 2nd Division. His question is, how do we go about solving the authorities, particularly about engaging in homeland settings? So in a homeland scenario, as was pointed out earlier, it's a law enforcement issue. That's the way the US are approaching it. And in Australia, we have state and federal law enforcement authorities that cross jurisdictions, and then as soon as we start getting into the air, it becomes multi-jurisdictional with CASA and the likes. How do we get around these problems?
Yeah, so I don't think you can get around the problem. The problem exists. We need to sit down and have some hard conversations as a whole of government with Home Affairs, CASA, law enforcement, The Army has capabilities at play here. Even the Air Force is going to be interested, as well as the Navy. How can we all come together and come up with a good solution that works? And it will probably require changing some of those roles and responsibilities. I don't have a solution, like that would be a great project for someone to do. But the UK came together and laid out roles and responsibilities for different parts of the government to deliver certain parts of the capability and to align these in a little bit better way. It's not perfect, but it's better than it was. So it really is a whole of government question, and having that whole of government knowledge is really important because, as the Army, you're going to be interested in how do I counter these things during wartime or even in the homeland if it comes to a bad situation. Law enforcement is worried about the homeland, and so understanding what the threats are, having a database of those threats that are out there, how they've been used, what are the threat capabilities and frequencies that they employ, all that kind of stuff could be warehoused at a single place in government so everyone could call upon it. This is what a center of excellence around counter-UAS could come to, as well as investing in technologies. We don't need, law enforcement, AFP investing in jamming technology while the Army is looking at the same thing. Are there ways to coordinate those technology investments such that they can be more effective?
Nice, thanks. We just got another question online from Corporal James at 9RQR. His question is, what methods of evasion are useful at section or the individual soldier level to avoid drones, particularly around the thermal camera systems that they might be employing? And should defence be looking at methods to counter systems such as AI, like you mentioned, the swarming systems, that could automatically defect our uniforms, camouflage and equipment without a human in the loop or on the loop?
So the answer is yes. You should be worried about these things. Any signature is a bad signature on the battlefield. So this gets to thinking about signature reduction, not just on the front lines, but potentially in the rear as well. And this is not a problem that many Western militaries have thought about facing in the past. And it's going to be a problem in the near future, is that there will be threats to the rear areas. Do individual soldiers need to think about this? Yes. And how do they best evade? I mean, there's probably some things you can learn from lessons on experiments or on training about, oh, this thing's overhead. Here's the imagery that the UAS guy got from me. And here's how, the other person in the unit was able to evade successfully. And learn from the Ukrainians. Like, they are learning how to hide from these systems on a day-to-day basis as well. So Ukrainian drone operators are hiding in trenches. They're trying to keep their signal from being broadcast too far to the adversary so they won't be seen from an electronic signals viewpoint. So yeah, there's a lot of it there. And I think I must have forgotten some of that question, huh? Did I get it all?
No, you're pretty comprehensive there. And I was just going to mention it's not too different from what we'd expect is, back when we were diggers, making sure you're in shell scrapes. You've got to think about the electronic magnetic spectrum, not just the visible. So it also means offsetting your broadcast and firing position potentially. And last question we'll have for the evening, then we'll have to call it wraps, is all the way from UK, Lieutenant Morrison, Royal Scots Guards. So thank you for your interest from the wrong side of the globe. You mentioned pre-launch disruption, but moved on. And he's just asking if you can elaborate more on those active or point him towards where he can find more on that.
Yeah. So typically when you think about countering a missile threat, most people think, oh, I wait until the missile's fired and then I counter it there for ballistic missiles or cruise missiles. But the easiest way to counter a missile threat is to destroy it before it's launched. Destroy the launcher, destroy the inventory of the missiles. This is a little bit harder in this mission area, but it's not impossible. So the small UAS don't take off from large airfields. They take off from a very small area. So identifying where they're launching from is a challenge, but sometimes they're coming from a centralized location. But the bigger one that has been effective, and the Ukrainians are worried about this now, is cutting off the supply of parts and UAS systems that are coming into a certain nation. And so the Chinese have said, we're going to cut off all UAS parts and systems flowing to Ukraine. They've put on export controls. So this is actually how they were able to counter some of that ISIL threat from what I understand. I didn't do a lot of, kind of digging into that aspect of the problem, but stopping the parts, stopping the finance trails can help. Maybe not so helpful against, a major power like Russia, but if you're importing a lot of the parts, that's one way to get at it. And trying to find, if you can kill the pilots, that's a good way to destroy the morale of the people operating these systems. So now it's not that easy to do when you get to autonomy, for example. And the other question was about how to counter autonomy specifically. And that's where the jamming doesn't work. And where you either need to cook the computer on board, which can be done with, you laze the sensors, for example, laze the electro-optic sensors, or you might use an EMP pulse to take out the computer such that it can't do its job. So that gets back to the last question. I knew I was forgetting something about that one. So, yeah.
Got there in the end, yeah. And again, it is a very interesting topic, and I do encourage everybody to get through it. And we do have a copy of Dr. Rhodes's report that will stay here in the PME library, but I do encourage you to get out, have a look at it. And the other UAV, UAS drone technology reports that are actually coming out on the ARC. And you'll find plenty more about that on the Cove as well. So it's been very informative, really do appreciate it. Highlight of my evening was more encouragement to get more eagles on the Orbat. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together. Dr. Carl Rhodes. Thank you.